Several cities in the U.S. have been submerged or flooded due to government projects, typically related to the construction of dams and reservoirs. These efforts were often aimed at flood control, hydroelectric power generation, or creating water supplies, but they led to the intentional flooding of towns and cities. Here are a few notable examples. 1. Kennett, Missouri, under Lake of the Ozarks. In the 1930s, the U.S. government constructed Bagnell Dam in Missouri, leading to the creation of Lake of the Ozarks. Several communities, including Kennett, were submerged as a result. 2. Old Butler, Tennessee, under Watauga Lake. Old submerged in the late 1940s when the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, built the Watauga Dam. The town is now underwater beneath Watauga Lake, and a new Butler was established nearby. 3. Damascus, Georgia, under Lake Seminole. The construction of the Jim Woodruff Dam in the late 1940s led to the creation of Lake Seminole, submerging parts of the community of Damascus. 4. Monticello, California, under Lake Berryessa. The small town of Monticello was flooded in the 1950s when the Monticello Dam was built, creating Lake Berryessa. The remains of the town are still underwater. 5. Pacifio, Arizona, under Lake Mead. As part of the Hoover Dam project, several small communities along the Colorado River, including Pacifio, were flooded to create Lake Mead in the 1930s. Number 6. Celeron, New York, under Chautauqua Lake. Flooding due to the Chautauqua Lake Dam submerged parts of Celeron in the early 20th century. These are examples of cities and towns that were intentionally flooded due to government infrastructure projects, transforming landscapes and communities in the process. Yes, several black towns and communities in the United States were deliberately flooded by the government for infrastructure projects such as the construction of dams, reservoirs, and lakes. These actions displaced residents and submerged thriving black communities underwater. Below are a few notable examples. 1. Oscarville, Georgia, under Lake Lanier. Year flooded, 1950s. Reason: the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers created Lake Lanier by damming the Chattahoochee River to provide hydroelectric power, flood control, and water supply. Background: Oscarville was a predominantly black community in Forsyth County. The area was submerged as part of the lake's creation. Before the flooding, many black residents had already been driven out by racial violence in 1912, but the flooding completed the erasure of Oscarville. Flint Creek Valley, Alabama, under Lake Martin. Year flooded, 1920s. Reason: the construction of the Martin Dam by Alabama Power Company to generate electricity led to the creation of Lake Martin. Background: several black communities were submerged when the dam flooded the area, displacing families and erasing local black history. 3. Clear Springs, Alabama, under Lewis Smith Lake. Year flooded, 1960s. Reason: the construction of the Lewis Smith Dam by the Alabama Power Company led to the creation of Lewis Smith Lake. Background: the lake submerged Clear Springs, a predominantly black farming community, displacing its residents. Like other similar projects, it was part of larger infrastructure developments that often overlooked the communities affected. 4. Boydtown, Virginia, under Kerr Lake. Year flooded, 1950s. Reason: the construction of the John H. Kerr Dam and the creation of Kerr Lake flooded several communities, including Boydtown, which had a significant black population. Background: Boydtown was submerged as part of this flood control and hydroelectric project, displacing residents and erasing parts of the town's history. 5. Parts of Seneca, South Carolina, under Lake Hartwell. Year flooded, 1960s. Reason: the construction of the Hartwell Dam by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers led to the creation of Lake Hartwell. Background: some predominantly black neighborhoods in the Seneca area were displaced and submerged when the lake was created. This was part of a broader trend where black communities were disproportionately affected by these infrastructure projects. 6. Lincoln Hills, Missouri, under Lake of the Ozarks. Year flooded, 1931. Reason: the construction of the Bagnell Dam by the Union Electric Company created the Lake of the Ozarks. Background: Lincoln Hills, a predominantly black community, was flooded during this process, displacing black families who had lived in the area for generations. These are just a few examples of Black towns and communities that were deliberately flooded by the U.S. government as part of infrastructure projects, often with little to no consideration for the impact on the residents, many of whom were displaced and lost their homes, land, and community ties. When the U.S. government deliberately flooded Black communities for infrastructure projects like dams and reservoirs, families were often compensated, but the compensation was frequently inadequate, unfair, or mishandled. The process often left the displaced families worse off than they were before, especially in Black communities. Below are some key factors surrounding compensation in these cases. 1. Eminent domain and compensation. Eminent domain is the legal process by which the government can seize private property for public use, such as infrastructure projects. In theory, the government is required to provide just compensation under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In many cases, families in Black communities were compensated, but the amount was often far below the true value of their homes, land, and businesses. Valuations for property in Black communities were frequently lower than those in white areas due to systemic racism, real estate practices, and economic disparities. 2. Examples of inadequate compensation. Oscarville, Georgia, under Lake Lanier. The government offered compensation to displaced residents, but records suggest that Black families received less than white families. Additionally, by the time of the flooding in the 1950s, many Black families had already been driven out by racial violence in the early 1900s, and they were not compensated for that loss of property or the subsequent flooding. Clear Springs, Alabama, under Lewis Smith Lake. In the case of Clear Springs and other Alabama communities flooded for lakes and dams, residents were given compensation, but many received only a fraction of what their land was worth. Displaced families had limited legal recourse to challenge the low offers due to systemic inequalities. Boydtown, Virginia, under Kerr Lake. Families from this community received compensation, but many complained that it was not enough to establish new homes or rebuild their lives. Black landowners often had less political power and legal representation to advocate for better compensation. 3. Limited legal recourse. Black communities often faced limited options for challenging unfair compensation. Many families lacked access to the legal resources or political influence needed to negotiate fair settlements. In the early to mid-20th century, many Black families were sharecroppers or did not have clear title to the land they lived on due to discriminatory land policies. In such cases, they were more vulnerable to displacement and less likely to receive full compensation. 4. Economic and social impact. Even when compensation was provided, the loss of community was not accounted for. Families were often displaced to areas with fewer economic opportunities, and the sense of community built over generations was lost. Black communities often had to rebuild from scratch with fewer resources. For example, in cases like Vanport, Oregon, which was a housing project for Black workers, displaced families faced challenges finding new housing because of discriminatory housing policies that limited where they could move. 5. Historical precedent of discriminatory compensation. There is a long history of discriminatory compensation practices tied to infrastructure projects. In many cases, Black landowners were pressured to accept low offers for their property or faced threats of legal action if they refused. In contrast, white landowners, who had greater access to legal representation and political networks, were often better able to negotiate higher compensation for their land. 6. Relocation programs. In some cases, government relocation programs were set up, but they were often poorly executed. For example, displaced families were sometimes moved to less desirable land or areas with fewer resources. In some instances, displaced Black families had to migrate to urban centers where they faced overcrowded living conditions and limited job prospects, further compounding the negative impact of the displacement. Conclusion. While compensation was legally required when Black communities were flooded for infrastructure projects, the reality is that many families were not fairly compensated. Racism, unequal property valuations, and lack of legal recourse meant that Black communities often received inadequate compensation and were left in worse economic and social conditions. The government's actions not only displaced these communities, but also contributed to long-term economic disparity and the erasure of their histories. Reports of explosions or loud noises heard by residents before the levees failed during Hurricane Katrina have contributed to conspiracy theories about intentional breaches. However, the official investigations into the levee failures did not find evidence to support the idea that the levees were deliberately blown up. The sounds some residents reported could have been related to a variety of factors, including the intense winds and storm conditions of the hurricane itself, structural failures, or the sounds of debris impacting the levees. The chaos and destruction during such a catastrophic event likely led to confusion and misinterpretation of what was happening. The Army Corps of Engineers and other agencies conducted thorough investigations into the levee failures, attributing them to design flaws, inadequate maintenance, and the unprecedented nature of the storm, rather than any intentional actions. While the feelings of distrust among residents are understandable, especially given the community's historical experiences, the consensus among experts is that the breaches were not caused by deliberate explosions. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the flooding caused widespread devastation in New Orleans, particularly in low-lying areas like the Lower Ninth Ward and New Orleans East. In the years following the hurricane, the population of New Orleans fluctuated as some residents returned to rebuild, while others relocated permanently. Many residents did move back, but the pace and extent of return varied depending on factors like the severity of damage, available resources for rebuilding, and government assistance. Some neighborhoods, such as the French Quarter and Uptown, recovered relatively quickly because they experienced less flooding. In contrast, areas like the Lower Ninth Ward saw a much slower return of residents due to the extensive destruction, challenges in rebuilding, and socioeconomic factors. The population of New Orleans today is still smaller than it was pre-Katrina, and some neighborhoods have never fully recovered. However, ongoing efforts have helped revitalize parts of the city, with infrastructure improvements and new housing projects attracting some former residents back. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the flooding caused widespread devastation in New Orleans, particularly in low-lying areas like the Lower Ninth Ward and New Orleans East. In the years following the hurricane, the population of New Orleans fluctuated as some residents returned to rebuild, while others relocated permanently. Many residents did move back, but the pace and extent of return varied depending on factors like the severity of damage, available resources for rebuilding, and government assistance. Some neighborhoods, such as the French Quarter and Uptown, recovered relatively quickly because they experienced less flooding. In contrast, areas like the Lower Ninth Ward saw a much slower return of residents due to the extensive destruction, challenges in rebuilding, and socioeconomic factors. The population of New Orleans today is still smaller than it was pre-Katrina, and some neighborhoods have never fully recovered. However, ongoing efforts have helped revitalize parts of the city, with infrastructure improvements and new housing projects attracting some former residents back. The Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans was one of the hardest hit areas during Hurricane Katrina, and its recovery has been slow and complex. Before the hurricane, the neighborhood was predominantly African American and working class, with deep community ties. The flooding caused catastrophic damage, and many homes were destroyed. After Katrina, the government and various organizations undertook several initiatives to rebuild and revitalize the area. 1. Housing and infrastructure rebuilding. Roads and utilities. The city and federal government focused on rebuilding essential infrastructure like roads, sewage systems, and utilities. Many streets were repaired, but some areas remained neglected for years. Residential rebuilding. The Road Home program was a federal initiative to help homeowners rebuild or sell their damaged homes. While some residents were able to rebuild through this program, there were complaints about delays, inadequate funds, and complex paperwork, making it difficult for many to return. Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation. Actor Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation built affordable, eco-friendly homes in the Lower Ninth Ward, starting in 2008. The program aimed to provide sustainable housing, but over time, some homes faced structural issues, and the foundation later faced legal challenges over faulty construction. Schools and community centers. Several schools and community centers were rebuilt or renovated as part of broader efforts to revitalize the area. The focus was on creating modern educational facilities and community spaces for residents to gather. For example, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Charter School for Science and Technology, located in the lower Ninth Ward, was one of the first public schools to reopen post-Katrina. 3. Flood protection. Levee repairs. After the levee failures during Katrina, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers invested heavily in strengthening flood protection systems, including the rebuilding of levees and the installation of flood walls. The Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, HSDRRS, was developed to protect New Orleans from future storm surges. A more robust flood protection system was put in place to minimize the risk of future flooding in vulnerable areas like the lower Ninth Ward. 4. Economic and social challenges. Despite these efforts, the lower Ninth Ward has faced long-term economic and social challenges. Many residents did not return due to lack of affordable housing, jobs, or the financial means to rebuild. Vacant lots and blighted properties remain a problem in some parts of the neighborhood. The local government and nonprofit organizations continue to work on redevelopment plans to attract investment and new residents. Measure 5. Green spaces and community projects. Efforts were made to create green spaces and parks, helping to restore some community life. Projects like urban farming initiatives and community gardens have been established to address food insecurity and create sustainable sources of produce for residents. Number 6. Nonprofit and grassroots efforts. Many nonprofits and community organizations have been instrumental in rebuilding the lower Ninth Ward. Organizations like Common Ground Relief and Lower Ninth Ward Homeownership Association have worked on housing, community development, and advocacy for residents to rebuild their homes and lives. Despite these efforts, the Lower Ninth Ward has not returned to its pre-Katrina population levels, and many areas still struggle with poverty, lack of infrastructure, and underinvestment. However, community resilience and ongoing efforts continue to shape its slow recovery. Yes, the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans has been significantly impacted by flood control measures, including the construction of levees and flood walls following Hurricane Katrina. While these measures aim to protect the area from flooding, they have also led to criticism regarding their effectiveness and the socioeconomic implications for the community. The neighborhood's vulnerability to flooding remains a concern despite these efforts. In the lower Ninth Ward, certain areas are particularly vulnerable to flooding and environmental issues, making them less suitable for long-term habitation. Neighborhoods that were heavily damaged during Hurricane Katrina and have not been rebuilt or maintained often have infrastructure issues, such as inadequate drainage and unstable ground. Specific sections near the levees, or those that experienced significant erosion or subsidence, may also be considered unfit for living. However, community efforts are ongoing to revitalize the area and address these challenges. The claim that the government intentionally blew up the levees in the lower Ninth Ward during Hurricane Katrina is a controversial topic. After the hurricane struck in 2005, the levee system failed in several areas, leading to widespread flooding. Some residents and conspiracy theories suggest that the levees were intentionally breached to protect other parts of the city, but there is no conclusive evidence to support this. Investigations into the levee failures primarily focused on the design and maintenance issues that contributed to their collapse. While the flooding caused by the levee breaches disproportionately affected the lower Ninth Ward, most experts agree that the failures were due to engineering shortcomings rather than a deliberate act. The lower Ninth Ward is indeed a historically Black community, and the deep-rooted issues of racial inequality and systemic neglect in urban planning contribute to the distrust many residents feel toward the government. The idea that the levees were intentionally breached to protect other areas is tied to broader concerns about environmental racism, where marginalized communities face greater risks from disasters and less investment in infrastructure. This distrust is exacerbated by the historical context of how Black neighborhoods have been treated in New Orleans and elsewhere. Many residents view the government's response to Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent recovery efforts as inadequate and biased, fueling conspiracy theories about deliberate actions taken against their community. These perspectives highlight the ongoing struggles for equity and justice in the aftermath of the disaster. The historical context of government actions against Black communities, including instances where flooding was used as a means to clear areas for development or infrastructure projects, indeed contributes to the skepticism surrounding events like the levee breaches during Hurricane Katrina. Throughout U.S. history, there have been cases where Black neighborhoods were targeted for urban renewal or infrastructure projects, leading to displacement and loss of community. This history fosters a perception that the government may act against the interests of marginalized communities. While there is no definitive evidence that the levees were intentionally breached in the Lower Ninth Ward, the community's experiences with systemic racism and neglect inform their beliefs and concerns. The intersection of race, environmental policy, and disaster response continues to be a critical issue in discussions about equity and justice in urban planning and recovery efforts. After Hurricane Katrina, the process of compensation and relocation for families in the Lower Ninth Ward was complicated and varied widely. Many families received some form of assistance through federal programs like the FEMA Individual Assistance Program or the Road Home Program, which aimed to provide financial aid to homeowners for repairs or relocation. However, the compensation was often criticized for being inadequate and insufficient to cover the costs of rebuilding or relocating. Many families faced challenges in navigating the bureaucracy, and those living in areas deemed high risk or closer to levees might have received different treatment compared to others. The overall recovery process was marred by disparities, and many Black families felt they were not adequately supported compared to other communities. This has led to ongoing discussions about equity in disaster recovery and the need for more comprehensive support systems for marginalized communities affected by such events. There is no credible evidence to support the claim that the government intentionally blew up the levees in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. Investigations into the levee failures primarily focused on design flaws, construction issues, and inadequate maintenance as the main reasons for the catastrophic breaches that led to widespread flooding. While conspiracy theories persist, especially among those who experienced the devastation and feel mistrustful of government actions, the consensus among engineers and investigators is that the levee failures were the result of systemic failures rather than deliberate acts. Reports from the Army Corps of Engineers and independent investigations highlighted the need for better infrastructure and flood protection, but they did not find evidence of intentional breaches. This topic continues to evoke strong emotions, especially given the historical context of racial inequality and environmental injustice that affects communities like the Lower Ninth Ward. Yes, as of 2024, there are families living in areas close to the levees and flood protection structures that were breached during Hurricane Katrina. Many parts of the Lower Ninth Ward and surrounding neighborhoods have seen a degree of rebuilding and revitalization since the hurricane, though the community still grapples with issues related to infrastructure, safety, and the long-term effects of the disaster. While some residents have returned and rebuilt their homes, concerns remain about the adequacy of flood protection in the area, especially in the context of climate change and increased flooding risks. Efforts have been made to improve the levee system, but some residents are still wary of living near these structures due to the memories of past flooding and ongoing vulnerabilities. The community continues to advocate for better infrastructure and disaster preparedness to ensure safety for those who live in close proximity to the levees. The idea of intentionally flooding the Lower Ninth Ward as a solution to flood control is complex and controversial. While some argue that managed retreat from high-risk areas might be a long-term solution to reduce vulnerability to flooding, this approach raises significant ethical, social, and economic concerns. 1. Community displacement. Flooding areas to prevent future risks could lead to the displacement of long-standing communities, disrupting lives and erasing cultural histories. 2. Loss of homes and property. Many residents have invested in their homes and neighborhoods. Forced relocation would result in significant financial and emotional loss. 3. Equity issues. Historically marginalized communities, such as those in the Lower Ninth Ward, often bear the brunt of such decisions, raising questions about equity and justice in disaster management. 4. Alternative solutions. Instead of flooding, many experts advocate for investing in more sustainable flood management strategies, such as restoring wetlands, improving drainage systems, and enhancing the existing levee infrastructure to make them more resilient. 5. Community involvement. Any decision about land use and disaster preparedness should involve the community's voices, ensuring that solutions reflect their needs and priorities. While the challenges of living in flood-prone areas are real, the focus should be on equitable solutions that prioritize the safety, dignity, and rights of the affected communities. The concerns about environmental justice and the treatment of Black communities, particularly in the context of disaster recovery and infrastructure projects, have gained more attention in recent years due to several factors. 1. Historical awareness. There has been a growing recognition of the historical injustices faced by marginalized communities, including the forced displacement of Black neighborhoods for urban development, flood control, and other projects. This awareness has led to calls for accountability and a reevaluation of past policies. 2. Advocacy and activism. Grassroots organizations and community activists have worked tirelessly to highlight these issues, pushing for equitable treatment, better infrastructure, and more inclusive decision-making processes. Their efforts have raised awareness and put pressure on government entities to address past wrongs and ensure fair treatment. 3. Environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement has brought attention to how marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards, including flooding, pollution, and inadequate infrastructure. This movement advocates for policies that prioritize the needs and rights of these communities. 4. Changing policy frameworks. There is a growing recognition within government agencies and organizations of the importance of integrating social equity into disaster response and recovery policies. This includes efforts to involve communities in decision-making processes and to create solutions that address their specific needs. 5. Climate change awareness. With increasing awareness of climate change and its impact on vulnerable communities, there is a heightened urgency to find sustainable solutions that prevent further displacement and ensure resilience against natural disasters. While the legacy of past injustices cannot be erased, these developments indicate a shift toward more equitable approaches that prioritize the voices and rights of historically marginalized communities in policy decisions related to disaster management and urban planning. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. We've got plenty more exciting videos coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.